Hey, welcome back for another episode in this passive income challenge. In this series, we're going to be building an app that generates a passive income of $1,000 a month. And we've already walked through the process of building an idea, going through making the initial prototype, mocks for that idea, and then getting feedback on the mocks. At this point, we're now in the step of refining the mocks that we've got. So we really want to basically nail the design and get the main flow of the user experience solid. What that means is we're going to take the feedback that we got in the previous episode and we're going to break it down into issues that actually impacted that happy path flow that I want to get the user through. So I want to get the user from landing on the site to booking an app. That is my primary happy path. And there's a lot of different ways they can do that, but there's one way that I've already mapped out as far as the flow, and I want to optimize that as much as possible. So what I've done is I've broken down the feedback in the previous episode into a spreadsheet, and I'm going to take each bit of feedback and make sure I respond if it's a blocking issue or a very impactful issue to that happy path flow. If it's an alternate path, like for example, talking about saving a trip for later, that would be an alternate path that might be nice to have, but for me that's not the main flow that I'm going to be working with right now because I want to optimize for them completing the booking in one session. We can revisit all these other paths later, but the key right now to me is just getting the happy path as optimized and easy to get through as possible and make sure there's just nothing confusing or blocking to stop the user from going through that flow. So I've broken down this list of feedback into a spreadsheet and I've started to rank the issues based on like stuff that's blocking that main flow, and I've ranked those as high priority issues. Anything that's somewhat impactful to that happy path flow, I'm going to call that a medium issue, and anything that's on that affects other paths or is purely stylish, then I'm going to rank that as a low priority issue. So I'm going to start going through this feedback and updating the mocks as I go. So let's jump into what the feedback was and how we can work with improving it. Okay, so I've gathered some feedback from the previous user test. And for each place that they got stuck or had an issue, I just marked like what the screen was, whether it was like a high priority issue. And then I started to try to come up with the problem statement that they ran into. There's a great quote by Henry Ford where he said, if I asked the customers what they wanted, they would have said they wanted a faster horse. And what that tells you is the user isn't always the best at telling you what the solution is to their problem, but they're really good at telling you that they have a problem. So just focus on identifying where the problems are, and if the user does have suggestions, we can listen to those and maybe they're good, but take them with a grain of salt, but then get at the fundamental problem that they're trying to solve there and see if there's other ways to solve it. So now I'm going to try updating the designs based on the feedback, and we'll see how that goes. So the last user test uncovered quite a few issues with the flight select screen. So that's this screen here where the user is supposed to pick the specific flights once they've selected a route. So what will happen here is the user would click either this or they'd click the add flight button here. And then that would take them to this screen here where they have to pick the next leg of that flight. And there's a lot of information appearing on the screen. It's a little bit confusing what it all represents. It also looks like this 311 here looks like a return flight potentially, and that also continues to be a problem on the final screen here where they've selected all three flights. And really what this was meant to show is the alternate route, but it definitely appears to look like a return flight that's part of their trip. So this is the second version of this screen, flight select. So I've added a lot of information here to try to make this more obvious what you're doing. So for one, it says select flights up here at the top. It also puts more emphasis on the current path that you have selected here. And then I've added it so there's step 1 and 2 so that you can see that currently you're selecting the flight from your origin city to your stop, and then from your stop to your destination. So once you've selected this, it then jumps into this screen here where you have this highlighted. I've taken away the return flight, or sorry, not the return flight, the alternate flight, which was meant to show how much you're saving. I'm just taking that away entirely here since it looked too much like a return flight. So I've also made it so that it's displaying the number of nights that each of these flights stays in your stop. So we'll select this flight here, and now this much more clearly represents the summary of the trip that they've selected, the origin flight, that they're staying 3 nights in Tampa. I've tried to put that in a timeline so that you can see. And I've gotten rid of the return flight confusion here. So it's much more clear what all of this is doing. So after making these changes based on the feedback, I had a couple more friends demo this for me. This time taking extra note of whether or not the users had issues with that flight select screen. Fortunately, it looks like the feedback actually helped because the new design had no issues with users going through that. It seemed to be pretty intuitive. Unfortunately, though, the new test revealed an issue with the search possibility screen.
I think that it's kind of tricky to see that this is a spot to stop, but in my brain, I'm kind of picturing this just as a long flight.
Yeah.
And for some reason, this flight path is just going this way, which is weird.
So the issue here is these flight paths don't look like they have a stopover. And it might be partially due to the curved lines. It might be because we're not emphasizing things enough as far as like having dots, or we don't have any text here displaying these stops. So there's a whole number of issues that I factored into how I was going to redesign this. And I came up with this alternative design, which puts much more emphasis on the stop. So it adds an extra dot here when it has the text of the name of the city. And then there's a plus sign here to kind of indicate that's you're adding an additional stop. At least that's the idea. And then this is like the base flight, the 311 here. So this is what you're comparing all of these to. So I think this is a much more intuitive flow for me. So I made those changes to that screen, and then I made some additional changes to this itinerary screen here. So I wanted to emphasize the direction that the user is flying to for each of these flights, because sometimes there's confusion over when something's a return flight or not, or if you're going to or from. So after making those final changes to the mocks, I ran this design through one final user test. And in this user test, I didn't have any of the same blocking issues that I experienced in the previous tests. And I only experienced 2 issues that were somewhat sticking points, but not necessarily completely blocking to the flow. And I think these are issues that I will address before I launch the first version, but let me just show those with you. So the first issue was with the return flight screen.
I feel like I have a choice here between purchasing this flight and then start over again, because now that I've got my flight to Columbia, I'm going to go back and find a flight from Columbia to Salt Lake. Add return flight, it's going to make it a lot easier, so I understand that I'm going to finish my route, and then that'll clarify the problem I'm having between this dilemma that I'm facing. So let's add destination.
So it's confusing about how you book the return flight, and it looks like you're just adding destinations all the time. And that was an issue that was brought up in a previous test. So it's something that now that I've had 2 users mention it, it's definitely something that I'm going to need to figure out. And then the second issue was with the booking screen, and it was just more of an issue with how I'm going to handle the multiple flights that you have to book.
So the friction that I'm experiencing here now is presumably this in the next stage of development, this is going to take me to a new tab. I'm going to book the flight. This is going to take me to a new tab. So now I'm going to be balancing 3 new tags and 3 separate credit card transactions. Nothing wrong with that, I don't think. I think you can pull that off if you're confident that that the value proposition is such that this is such a drastic markdown from a traditional Expedia or a Priceline type service. Because even though you're aggregating flights across a site, at the end it comes down to one number, one credit card entry, and that's it,
So I'm not sure if there's a really great solution for that. So that's probably something that's better solved once I get to the coding stage anyway, because then I can actually try out some different possibilities and see what I can actually do there. So I'm really happy with what this feedback has produced, because it's allowed me to iterate on this design a lot and test some assumptions that I was making about how users would want to interact with this flow. And I've doing that before I've even coded anything. So I think it's going to make my job coding a lot easier now that I know more what I'm going to build right from the get-go. So I'm ready to move on to the next phase, which is going to be coding this. And so it's going to be cool because we're going to start to see the app come alive. So I'm going to start to build out the foundations of the application and try to get the app into a state where it's relatively easy for me to add new features and to start building all the functionality that I've planned out for the initial V1 of this app. So that's all. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next video.